Welcome to the fourth class of Food Literacy for All, and we're glad to see a packed house once again. We have an absolutely dynamic speaker tonight. Again, one of the most brilliant persons that I know, and he's also humorous. He's funny as hell. So, and even sometimes I don't think he wants to be, but that comes across. So if you're joining us from Detroit, we are live streaming from Detroit. I can never remember that word. I always want to say simulcast, but we're live streaming to Detroit. And so for those who are joining us from Detroit, like last week, I want to greet you with the official Detroit greeting and say, "What up, doe?" Also, if you're a student enrolled in the course, so we have community members and students. If you're a student enrolled in the course, we want to remind you that your first essay is due next week. And also, we want to remind you that you can tweet in questions, particularly those who are joining from Detroit, and you can tweet those to hashtag Food Literacy for All. So I had the opportunity to meet Raj Patel, I think in 2011. We were in a fellowship together called the Food and Community Fellowship. And he, I, and one other member of that fellowship immediately gravitated towards each other because of our disdain for capitalism and also white supremacy and patriarchy. And so we continue to share those very important bonds in this moment that we live in today. So I want to read his official bio. Raj Patel is an award-winning writer, activist, and academic. He's a research professor in the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin, and a senior research associate at the Unit for Humanities at the university currently known as Rhodes University in South Africa. And in parentheses next to Rhodes, it says Uhuru, which is a Kiswahili word that means freedom. I like that name much better because Rhodes was certainly a scoundrel and a criminal. He holds degrees from the University of Oxford, the London School of Economics, and Cornell University, has worked for the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, and has protested against them throughout the world. He's a visiting scholar at the University of California, Berkeley Center for African Studies, an honorary research fellow at the School of Development and Studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and continues to be a fellow at the Institute for Food and Development Policy, also known as Food First. In 2016, he was recognized with the James Beard Leadership Award, James Beard Foundation Leadership Award. Raj co-taught the 2014 Edible Education class at the University of California, Berkeley with Michael Pollan. He's also an institute, or he was also an Institute for Agriculture Trade Policy Food and Community Fellow from 2011 through 2013. He's testified about the causes of the global food crisis to the U.S. House Financial Services Committee and was an advisor to Oliver D. Schutter, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. In addition to numerous scholarly publications in economics, philosophy, politics, and public health journals, he regularly writes for The Guardian and has contributed to the Financial Times, Los Angeles Times, New York Times, Times of How does he have time to do all this, right? And the San Francisco Chronicle. The Mail on, we're not through, the Mail on Sunday and the Observer.
Sweet Jesus, Malik.
His first book was Stuffed and Starved, The Hidden Battle for the World Food System, and his latest book, The Value of Nothing, is on the New York Times bestseller list. He can be heard co-hosting the Food Politics podcast, The Secret Ingredient, with Mother Jones's Tom Philpott and KUTS's Rebecca McEnroy. He is currently working on a groundbreaking documentary project about the global food system with award-winning director Steve James. He's also completing a book on world ecology with Jason W. Moore for the University of California Press entitled 7 Cheap Things. Please welcome Dr. Raj Patel.
Thank you. Can you hear me at the back? Is this on? It is. Okay, good. Splendid. So we have so much to get through today, and the trouble is that you've already heard two fabulous speakers talk about systems and about what the food system is. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to suffer you to hear yet another interpretation about what the world food system is. And I'm going to talk about the long green revolution. Let's see if this clicker can be persuaded to work. It cannot. I wonder why. Is there a reason? Work, damn you. Let me turn it on. I'm pressing the button. It's just... Okay.
Try the arrow for now.
Try the arrow. I will use arrows. There we go. There it is. So the long green revolution. But in order to do that, I mean, I want to sort of set the green revolution into context. And I want to set the food system into context. And you may think, well, the food system, it's about these relations of culture and politics and economics. And you may think it's about this little myth of scarcity. And yes, it is all those things. But one of the things that the food system produces is unusual. And you may not think about it initially. But you know, the food system produces food, it produces cuisines, it produces culture, but it also produces you. Now, in order to demonstrate this, I want to sort of just begin with a couple of quick questions. Are you confused about what to eat? Let me just raise your hand. This isn't even an eye clicker question, but have you ever been in a supermarket and found yourself baffled by what it is that you're surrounded by? Have you ever experienced a moment of, what the, no. Now, this is an eye clicker question, and so let me just line you up. How many calories do you consume daily? I'm going to give you the options. Is it under 1,200? 1,200 to 1,599, 1,600 to 2,000, or more than 2,000? Let's run those. And just, what do you think? How many calories do you consume a day, people? We're going to close the poll in 3 seconds. 2, 1. Last guesses. All right. What does the survey say? Ah, that's fascinating. So that's a little bit optimistic. But let's hold that for a moment. Let me ask you another question, which is horribly worded and shouldn't be an eye clicker question or any other kind of question, but I'm going to do it anyway. This is just a super quick, like 20 seconds of eye clicker. Who is most responsible for making sure processed food is part of a healthy diet? It's a rubbish question. It's not mine, but I'm going to ask it, and I'm going to find out. You're going to find out in a second why. So, is it government regulators, food manufacturers, food retailers, or individuals? Or is it school meal programs? So, from A, B, C, D, or E, who is most responsible for making sure processed food is part of a healthy diet? We're going to close. Again, this is just a random, it doesn't even matter. But that's 3, 2, 1, and what do we have? Again, super interesting. This is the bit that I think is fascinating. Maybe one of the best ways of explaining why I think it's fascinating that 30% of y'all feel like that you're individually responsible for the content of your diet and processed food in it, is to look at something that the James Beard Foundation Food Conference, a presenter at the James Beard Foundation Food Conference, Miriam Arend. Now, Miriam is head of the Good Housekeeping Institute. And I just want to play you sort of 4 or 5 minutes of her presenting some of the findings from their survey of Good Housekeeping readers. And then we'll talk about it. Let's see if that's working.
And they're not keeping track of calories. 83% said they do not keep track of calories. When asked, though, how many calories they think they consume on a typical day, only 2% said they consume more than 2,000 calories. So, exactly, our reaction. One has to wonder, given all the snacking they're doing, if they have any notion at all of how many calories they're consuming. And as Samantha Cassey, our nutrition director, said when I showed her these results, she goes, well, if people were really consuming the number of calories they thought, we wouldn't have an obesity problem in this country. There is an intention and desire, though, among women to be smart about what they eat. They just want it made easy for them. 93% of Good Housekeeping readers surveyed said that nutrition plays an important role when selecting foods to eat at home, and nearly 3/4 said the same when ordering at a restaurant. More than 90% said they always, often, or sometimes order from a healthy menu when it's available. So when healthy food is available, they go for it. I think it's important for the chefs in this room to know that women feel that restaurant menus are they feel that they're highly influential on how they eat, more than fast food menus, packaged food manufacturers, and government regulators. I also think it's impressive that they're willing to take responsibility for that, how they eat. The majority don't blame their indulgences on the widespread availability of food or on how supermarkets display sweets to be tempting. They don't say that government regulators or food manufacturers are most responsible for ensuring that the food they eat is healthy. They do put the onus on themselves. It may be, I was trying to think about the reason for this, and I was thinking, well, maybe it's that they've seen attempts by government to influence what we eat. You know, Mayor Bloomberg's attempted ban of oversized sodas, and maybe they're just saying, I'm ready to take responsibility for what I eat. I want to be in charge.
So the reason I find that fascinating is because she lists off some of the many reasons why the food system is tilted towards encouraging us to consume way more calories than is good for us, and certainly way more than 2,000. And at the same time, she says, well, yes, we're being sold these high-calorie goods left, right, and center. Yes, these food corporations are profiting from us at every turn, and yet it is our fault and our responsibility alone as individuals to take responsibility for the food system and internalize it in ourselves, and to turn ourselves into the right and individual arbiters of what it is that goes into our mouths, and not to hold the system accountable. And I think that that's a moment where we're blaming the victim, where the food system has created us as, essentially it's asking us to be nutrition professors. And I am a nutrition professor at the University of Texas. And I'm baffled by when I go to the supermarket. I have no idea what most of this stuff is because it's obfuscated. And yet we're all expected to be masters of understanding the minute forces that encourage us to consume left, right, and center. And we've been made by the food system in some very particular ways, some very strange ways. Here's another way that the food system has made us. And this is a sort of slightly orthogonal sort of a moment here. But let me show you a question that was asked in a Pew survey in 2010. The survey asked, among other things, offered to the respondents this question: when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women, said the survey. And people across different nations were asked to respond. And there was a very marked national difference. So, for example, at the low end, Iceland, only 3.6% agreed with that statement, whereas Egypt agreed 99.6%. Now, this survey cropped up in a very important and not sufficiently studied paper that looked at, well, how do we explain that? And so I'm going to ask you, this is another clicker question. So, what explains the difference between the countries' different attitude to women's roles? Is it the presence or absence of oil? No, this is a serious. I mean, the presence or absence of oil can no, for real, yo. When countries have or don't have oil, that can have a marked consequence in the way that the state behaves and what it funds and what it doesn't. So the presence or absence of oil can be a factor. Is it religion? Is it underwear advertisements? Is it the mainstream media, or is it plows? Some of you may see that actually I've just been making this up just so I can get Trump here. Let's run the clicker question, shall we? We will stop at 1 minute exactly. So, which of these things? What do you think? Any more for any more? I just want to put the Mad King's name up there. We'll talk about him later. All right, what do we got? Oh, sweet Jesus, this is a food class. It's plows. No, the paper was in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And what they found was that if you control for a range of factors, societies that have traditionally, over the past 200 years, used the plow, systematically polled more sexist. Systematically polled more sexist. How? What is it about this farming implement that makes an entire society more likely to say when jobs are scarce, men should have them over women? What is it about the food system? Because it has to be about the food system. It involves plows. How does that happen? Well, to answer this question, we need to understand capitalism and patriarchy and racism. And we need to understand the rise of cash agriculture, and in particular, the journeys of those scurrilous knaves of industrial capitalism, the Portuguese. This is a map of the various places that the Portuguese went and conquered. And in particular, there's this wee island over here, Madeira, which they first encountered in 1419. Now, Madeira, the island of Madeira, Ilha do Madeira, the island of wood, this is what it looks like now. I mean, it was covered in trees when the Portuguese first got there. And here I'm drawing on some work that my co-author, Jason W. Moore, has done, and that's in the book. And what, the argument that we're making is that the origins of modern capitalism can be found on this island in the production of capitalism's first major commodity crop, which was sugar. And so the story is this. Look, first of all, the Portuguese come and the island's full of wood, and they use that to, they chop it down, they use it to make, they use it for lumber, for construction, and for ships in particular. But then they realize that if you bring a range of other things to the island, you can turn this island into a sugar plantation. But in order to do that, first of all, you need hydrological engineering. You need to transform nature. And you need the finance to do that. You need capital, in this case, capital from Genoa, from Italy. And then you need workers to do it. Initially, it's indigenous people, and then when they are exterminated, it's slaves from North Africa, usually Muslim slaves, who are brought to the island to work. So you have nature, capital, finance. You also need those workers to be taken care of for free, and so women's work is an integral part of this. You need cheap food. Usually the workers just steal some of the sugar cane to be able to survive. You need fuel to fuel this entire enterprise. And so Madeira experiences a huge boom over 75 years, where the island, once covered with trees, 75 years later, travelers come to Madeira and wonder why it's called Madeira, because there aren't any trees that can be seen. And the entire island is burned to the ground. The wood in Madeira, the fuel that once was lumber, but it becomes fuel under capitalism. And that fuel is used in the process of manufacturing sugar. And all of this is governed under the idea that there should be cheap lives, that the lives of the people who die in the manufacture of the sugar are set at naught. These 7 cheap things, we can talk about them later, but in order for modern capitalism to happen, you need a range of things. You need exploitation, you need exploitation of the environment, you need cheap fuel, you need cheap food, you need a range of things to happen in order for modern capitalism to obtain. And this is a global process, because once Madeira is burned through, 75 years, Europe ate the sugar and the sugar ate the island. And then you're left with the remains of an island on which then people start to grow grapes that become Madeira wine. But again, there's no wood on the island to mature this wine in, and so it's matured in casks that come from the New World. Right? You have to bring the wood over from the Americas to make wine on this island because there's no wood left. And once the island is burned through, you have to go other places to find your sugar and a range of other crops, and you develop this baroque system of international exchange, which, let's be clear, it's not really exchange, it's colonialism. This would be a map of the world that Europe colonized in the process of developing modern capitalism. And I just want to put that up there because although the story that I'm telling is sort of a Eurocentric one, it's Eurocentric because Europe did this to the planet. And I just wanted to sort of meditate on that for a second. because the history of European colonization is something that still lives, and still lives in ideas of white supremacy, which of course we suffer with today. But the idea of the transformation of the planet wasn't just about conquering stuff and setting things on fire. It was also about cultural changes, and in particular, changes around regimes of property. So I want to show you this just sort of progressive transformation of the way that things were owned in a village in England, Thurgarden. I'm borrowing a map from Ellis Morgan, an English historian, who shows a process whereby land that once in its entirety used to belong to the University of Cambridge starts getting parceled up and owned by progressively more and more powerful farmers. And so, whereas here you have the commons, an area in which peasants were toiling away for the landowner, in this case, the University of Cambridge. But they were able to survive because they had access to land where, for example, women could dairy, could raise cattle. But progressively, that land becomes enclosed and owned. And so more and more, in particular, women's work becomes excluded from the possibility of agricultural capitalism. And so you end up with large, contiguous farms on which plows and industrial machinery can be applied. And if you want to see a picture of modern industrial agriculture, here it is. This is really cutting-edge modern agriculture. I mean, it's 1750, but everything that's important about modern capitalist agriculture is here. So this is a picture by Thomas Gainsborough, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. And first of all, you've got nice, neat rows, plowed rows, and sometimes there's speculation that the seeds would have been put here by a seed drill, a technology that had been invented in 1704, but still wasn't very popular by 1750, invented by Jethro Tull. I just want to say Jethro Tull. So Jethro Tull invented this, and you can see that workers, now invisible, have left the fruits of their labor here. You can see enclosure, the process of driving people off the commons has happened here. So you've got your fences and your sheep that are far more profitable than letting peasants have access to land on which they can survive. All of this is actually a place. This is a place called the Aubrey's in Sudbury in England. And that oak tree is still there. And you've got, of course, the Andrews themselves. Mr. Andrews here is, in the clothing of his time, he's as relaxed as it is possible to be in public. It's like he's wearing a sort of kiss the chef apron. Look at him. It's just like. He's obviously. He's relaxed, and why shouldn't he be? He owns all of this. He owns it because his father was a silversmith, part of the Guild of Silversmiths, and had access to silver from the New World, and he owns it because his wife's family owned large chunks of this, and now because they're married, he owns it. And he owns his dog, and very interestingly, people have looked at Mrs. Andrews and seen something obviously very different. Whereas she is absolutely rigid. She appears in this portrait as property. There's a gap in the canvas here where some speculate that the Gainsborough was going to put a bird that had been shot with his gun, his dog had retrieved and put on his wife's lap, or it may have been a child, a little junior Andrews. But either way, the relationships of domination here are about power and about patriarchy and about the transformation of women's roles under capitalism. In other words, this whole scene has been arranged so that the plow can work here and work its magic, but also that the household has been transformed, so that she and her role have been utterly divorced from what it might have been generations before. So this is the story of how the food system has a technology like the plow that can result in sexism that is enforced wherever the plow is taken. This is the story of how we are made by the food system. And if you're still unpersuaded, I mean, bear in mind that there were copious kinds of instruction manual that were given to Mrs. Andrews in order for her to participate in the food system. Her participation was strictly within the domains of the kitchen. So you had books like The Nutritional Expert, Sir Hugh Platt's bestseller, and it was a bestseller apparently, called Delights for Ladies to Adorn Their Persons, Tables, Closets, and Distilleries with Beauties, Bouquets, Perfumes, and Waters. It's not a snappy title, but it did sell well in 1608 when it came out. But there's a really important book that I think is tremendous in the history of creating modern individualist capitalist consumers of food, and that's this book, The English Malady. So The English Malady was written by George Cheney, who was at one time a friend of Isaac Newton. And so the English malady, does anyone know what the English malady is? The English malady was obesity. So he's writing a text in 1733 about obesity, about what has happened to a certain stratum of the bourgeois English who have become overweight through their control over the means of production. Their wealth has meant that they're not doing terribly much physical activity and they are eating copiously. But this isn't just a sort of, you must eat differently. What's very interesting about this is that in this particular edition, there's the addition of something called with the author's own case at large. So there's a part of this book where Cheney is saying, yes, we're surrounded by food and it's very bad to eat, but he also confesses. He uses a very old literary form, the confession, to explain how he has transformed and transformed himself away from obesity towards something else. And that idea of the confession, of using your own body and using yourself as the repository of responsibility and of being wholly in charge of what it is that a system has produced. Well, we've seen that much more recently. But in doing that, George Cheney was, he was a kind of Restoration Oprah. He advertised himself as Europe's heaviest man. He claimed to weigh near 500 pounds. And part of his confession was about how horrible his body was. A putrefied, overgrown body from luxury and perpetual laziness, scorbutical all over. And if you want to find a sort of history of fat shaming, this is sort of where it begins, with a certain kind of idea of what it is a body should be, and the invitation, in this particular case, that society should mock him. And I think that, again, since we live in a world in which fat shaming is a very real issue, we can find that and the ideas that come along with fat shaming around individual responsibility and weakness of will. All of it is here in 1733. And again, when we look inside ourselves, we find ourselves tainted by these very ideas of taking individual responsibility for things that are systemic. And I think he offers his own kinds of ways out of this, to be fair. He has a what to eat guide. I don't think you can quite see this, but on the one hand, he's got things that are easy to digest that you should eat: hares, sheep, kids, goat kids, not kids, and pullet, turkey, and then things you should stay away from: red deer, snipe. What's important and interesting about this list is it's about sort of the categorization of luxury. But I think that this gets to sort of the midpoint of the talk. Basically, what I'm arguing is that the food system is systemic in ways that have created who we are and our attitudes to scarcity, the attitudes to what technology needs to be doing, our attitudes around how and who should feed the world. And we find ourselves conflicted and confused by this. And if you are confused, then that's fine, because the confusion around what to put in our bodies is not a bug of the modern food system, it's a feature. The confusion around what we should be eating, how it is that things enter our body, all of this is not accidental to the food system. I mean, even when Cheney was writing, there was strange food coming from Peru, for example. These weird, sort of strange things that were initially just fed to horses, but then by dint of aggressive marketing, people started to eat them, and that's why we eat potatoes in the quantities that we do. And if you feel like, well, that was then, quick show of hands. I mean, who here has eaten quinoa? Who here 15 years ago had eaten quinoa? Strange food from Peru that we have been persuaded by aggressive marketing is good for us in some way. And now all of us are eating, cheerfully eating food that tastes like gravel. Again, if you think that this is a sort of 1700s issue, it's not. We find ourselves conscripted and reused in ways as consumers in a food system in which confusion reigns, in which our multiplicity of choices that come from these trade routes from around the world are set to baffle. And we are constructed in ways that, that make us sort of strange consumers, and that make us consumers in the first place. And that make us hold ideas that are important around how it is that the urgent question of feeding the world. And so in the second part of the lecture, what I want to do is just touch on this idea of the Green Revolution. Now, the idea of the Green Revolution sounds very benign, and if you look at some of the data, it looks terrific. Basically, the idea of the Green Revolution is the spread of the plow and its attendant technologies. The idea is that the Green Revolution fed the world. And if you just look at the sort of surface level story of the Green Revolution that was produced by the modern food system, it looks great. Because you have a total world population that's growing not nearly as fast as the food supply. We've outrun Malthus. We've done much better than, we've avoided the sort of population collapse. And people are like, well, how much longer can this last? Yields are dropping and population are increasing and people are shagging and they are producing babies and those babies want food and we must provide food for those babies. And so, the Green Revolution rests on these Malthusian ideas, these ideas from Thomas Robert Malthus about food supply and population and the fight to keep them separate. The chief architect of this, if there's one man, of course there wasn't, but if there's one, it's Norman Borlaug, who was famously won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for his work on plant breeding. We don't have enough time to get sufficiently into Norman Borlaug, but it's worth understanding that the Green Revolution was political, and in order to understand that, I do need to do one more clicker question to see if you've done your reading or not. So the Green Revolution, right? Actually, why is it called the Green Revolution? So was it because it made many people very rich? Was it because it was an environmental improvement? Was it because it resulted in a lot more green fields? Is it because it emphasized hemp production? You can tell I'm running out of ideas. Or because it wasn't red or white. So let's do a quick clicker-rama. Green Revolution. Why was it called the Green Revolution? All right. Well, we'll close the polls in 3, 2, 1. Ta-da. Really? All right. So the answer, of course, was that it wasn't red or white. Those of you who had done the reading, 3% of you, will recognize this quote. Look, this is the quote that names the Green Revolution. And it comes from William Goud, the administrator of the US Agency for International Development. I imagine won't exist much longer, but there we go. These and other developments in the field of agriculture contain the makings of a new revolution. It is not a violent red revolution like that of the Soviets, nor is it a white revolution like that of the Shah of Iran. I call it the green revolution. And again, the logic here is that we're talking about sort of Malthusian catastrophe. Let's go back to this. So there it is. The policymakers were incredibly worried that if these lines crossed, like the streams in Ghostbusters, if they cross, what's going to happen? What happens when population outstrips food supply? Well, the answer is that people go communist. This was a legitimate fear. We have it in documents from the State Department. The State Department officials were very worried that actually hungry, angry mobs in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, if there wasn't enough food around, they would take to the streets, they would take to the urban streets. This isn't about rural people. They'll take to the urban streets, and if they don't have cheap food, they will riot, and then they will find a better way of organizing the world and a better way of organizing agriculture, and they will go communist. And so the Green Revolution was specifically a US intervention to increase crop productivity in some basic key crops. So, for example, in Mexico, where Norman Borlaug was doing his work, the staple crop in Mexico is corn. So that's why Norman Borlaug was doing wheat. Wheat was the crop that he was experimenting on in Mexico, and people said, "Well, have you noticed that people are eating corn?" And he goes, "Yeah, no, I understand that, but actually, for the proper commercialization of this, you need people with large areas of land. You need commercial farmers who can follow the sophisticated instructions for using these hybrid seeds. And so what you don't want is peasant farmers on the land. You want commercial farms, like the kind that we saw in the Gainsborough picture. You want commercial farms in which rows of wheat will be planted, and then they will be available cheaply for people in the cities. The Green Revolution, again, never about the people in rural areas, particularly. And in its own terms, it succeeded. It produced lots of food, and fewer places went communist than perhaps would have gone communist otherwise. But let me just get to one of the places where the Green Revolution is alleged to have succeeded massively, and that's India. There was a New Yorker article about Vandana Shiva recently, in which the author, Michael Spector, talked about how food production had doubled in India between 1967 and 1969. And if you look at wheat production, you can see that actually it's kind of true. Look, we've got wheat production pretty much doubling. Not quite, but almost. But you've got to ask why. And the miracle of the Green Revolution wasn't really about magic seeds. It was about the end of a drought. It was about higher prices for farmers. It was about more farmers planting more land with this stuff. And all of a sudden, the magic of the Green Revolution as captured in seeds and in this magical technology that Norman Borlaug administered falls away. And in fact, what you're left with is a story of the Green Revolution that's about power, that's about economics, that's about state support, that's about also population control. And the story of the Green Revolution, you might think, well, look, I don't care what what magic you use to double production. You doubled production. Surely that's a good thing. But it's not necessarily clear that it is, because look at the daily per person calorie and protein intake estimates in India from 61 to 1980. You would have thought that the period of the Green Revolution would have been unambiguously good. And it's not clear that it is. It's not clear that having more food leads to better outcomes. There's just, the data don't suggest that. And I don't want to rehash the grounds that Frankie and Ricardo have already taken you through. Instead, what I want to do in the last 10 minutes is talk about ways that our story so far might inform us in transforming the food system. To do that, what I want to do is draw on work that Rachel Besner-Kerr and her colleagues in Malawi have been doing, and I've been involved with some of that more recently. But when Rachel was a graduate student at Cornell, looking for a dissertation topic, she found herself in Malawi in the year 2000. That was characterized by a range of struggles. Life expectancy was 46 years old. HIV/AIDS prevalence was 14%. I mean, that's obviously contributing to diminished life expectancy. Child malnutrition, understood as stunting, was 55%. 55%. And per capita income was around $150 per person. So in this situation, a nurse at the local neonatal rehabilitation unit, so a unit where mothers take their children when they're absolutely massively malnourished, just for emergency kind of infusions of food and of drips in some cases. The local nurse understood what was going on. She goes, well, it's clear. The reason that people are malnourished is because the only thing they're eating is the staple crop in Malawi, which is corn. And so what we need to do is diversify the diet. The trouble is that normally you would hope that agricultural extension agents would diversify the diet. And because of the World Bank and the IMF shrinking Malawi's aid budget and controlling the government, the Agriculture Department had very little to offer farmers. And so Rachel and Esther found some money to start experimenting with seeds. And from 125 farmers, they started what are called farmer research groups. And these farmer research groups were basically just experimenters. The farmers were scientists, women and men, and they were experimenting with cowpea and mucuna and a range of crops that were both good for the soil and were that were providing a range of dietary diversity. So in the end, many of them ended up replicating the three sisters of corn, beans, and squash. You can see this Mesoamerican agricultural system where the beans fertilize the soil, the corn is the staple that everyone wants, you get squash and the big leaves of the squash shade out some of the competing plants. Now, here's a question then. You've got amazing food production. From 125 farmers, it goes to several thousand farmers join this program. And they start producing more food. And all of a sudden, you start having more food than ever before. And you have this amazing range of food that's not just corn. You have this fantastic dietary diversity. But the farmers are worried. And they're worried because they're concerned that it's possible under this fantastic agroecological system for there to be more food and for infant malnutrition to go up. How is it possible for there to be more food and infant malnutrition increases? How can you have more food and more malnourished kids? How does that happen? Why were they worried? Shout it out. They're cash crops. Well, in this case, although there have been some attempts certainly corn is a cash crop, but some of these others really aren't cash crops, and they're the more nutritious ones. So it's not that they're cash crops. Other reason, how can you have more food coming out of the ground and more malnourished children? Exported. Again, the Indians, there's a lot of talk about the Chinese in Africa, but actually India is trying to take some of the tur dal out of Malawi. But at this time, that wasn't a concern. So more babies. No, it's not a Malthusian thing. It's not like everyone's like, we've got beans, let's shag. So no, that's not it either. Processed food. There's certainly a push, certainly from USAID and a range of other forces, to bring more processed food into this world. But no, it's not about processed food. There we go. So someone almost said it. It's not about land grabs necessarily, because actually the land holding system here is fairly feudal, and so there's some stability for people who are part of the community to be able to get land. But no, the reason that they were worried is because harvesting is women's work. But so is cooking and cleaning and fetching firewood and breastfeeding. And so if there's more harvesting to do, and you still have to breastfeed and cook nutritious meals and fetch water and carry firewood, then the quality of meals can go down and the amount of breastfeeding can go down. So this was a concern. How do you solve that? Change attitudes about who harvests would be right if, but actually women's harvesting is a victory for women, because if you harvest, you get to control the sale of the crop, and then you get to control the household income. That's hard won in this particular part of Malawi, as far as I understand. So it's not giving men control of the harvest might result in men selling it at for a ridiculously low price and going to get drunk. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen, and it's a concern. So this is a way in which women actually break patriarchy by controlling household income. So you don't want to do that. What else can you do? But this is $150 per person per year. And it's because it's agroecological. There's a range of different things to be doing. Get the men to cook. That's right. Thank you. So how do you do that? Give them a grill. Yeah. So what they do initially, there is this process of, well, you know. And remember, these are ideas coming from the farmers themselves, and it's a series of experiments. So the first experiment is kind of Food Network style experimenting, where the farmers, are visited. The family in toto is visited by part of the farmer research team and a nutritionist, and then they'll come out and say, "Man of the house, come out here. You may have seen your wife hunched over this. It's a pot." And the man will be like, "Well, I've often wondered how that works," and then then there'll be some instruction, there'll be some delicious food and experimenting with different, some of these new crops, and all of a sudden the man's like, "Oh, thank you, that's delicious, that's absolutely wonderful, thank you very much indeed, you've changed my life," and people will go off into the sunset, and of course, nothing changes. I mean, like the Food Network. I mean, it was entertainment. You don't watch the Food Network to end patriarchy. That's not what it's for. But the idea of joy was important, and pleasure and conviviality. These things were important. And so what they did next was do something called a recipe day. And I want to just, in a second, I'll show you what that looks like. But basically, a recipe day is a moment where 100 people, women, men, and children, come together and teach each other how to cook. And it becomes a sort of prefigurative community, a space where equality can prevail just for a little bit, where anyone can teach anyone, and where you have a contest. In Silicon Valley, this would be called gamification. But you have a contest to produce food with these new ingredients. So some of these things are unusual, but peasants are interested in new foods and new ways of experimenting with them. And so you have this amazing sort of zone of exchange and of equality, and it also becomes a space where women can teach men, and also where women can call men out on our shit. It becomes a moment where you can talk about patriarchy, where you can make the personal political in a way that's safe. And then you follow it up with some hard feminist organizing. And so what I want to do is show you a clip from this documentary that we're working on. It's about 8 minutes long. But it's, just to give you some background, this was a few years ago, but the film was shot by Steve James, the director of Hoop Dreams. And we're working together on this at the moment, and I'm very excited about it. So let me just give you a little taste of this thing here.
Tangu ikakosoda na tushuga pachoko waka na mafuta tangutirapo pasi pachoko na tumchere taikako so tataikako vila mbwene tukuvika pa moto
pasaizi kutapa vapsha mbwe tukutora mafuta tukuika pa moto pasifuria na kuika pa moto
tindanjire mbungwe chifukwa nkuwerezeka bungwe chifukwa ndikukwaka ngekufumira mikoka itu tikakhalanga kusuzikira vose vinthu kagwiranga ndini kwakuyana nawe tikupika kupenja dende kwali kulima uku kucherera kukaye natenge vanyana kubeka yayi nachereranga ndine mlenje kwako kuti tatola kuma 2000 kweni nyingo yose yakumanyuma iyi vanga vakuti para ine nina nthumbo nyake mwana wari kumusana tacherera tose kumunda ndikuti pati kufuma kumunda tikwenda iwo vanyani vakwenda waka uchopu wakambaka pano ndikuti pala tafika pano vanyumba mbwenu wakukhala waka pampando hapo chete kweni kwa sono na tikanjira mbungwe vakatisambizika vajenda kuti mwanalume angagwira ntchito za chanakazi mbuto hii ni za soni niilamukapokapo imwe shaka kweni icho chikumbika nchakuti ngee mungalimbikiranga nanga uli kamba choko udongo lingasintha nyengo ineyo icha
tikuona kuti mlanyitu tukukwa viviri monadi kweni kuno kwitu ndikutanga takhalira
kuno mwakhalira nadi ndipo swapo vikusuzika chomene kuno mwanyitu mwanalume chigaya chinu chitu chakupama munguvipulikisika makonacha vajenda ngenkanira tikayanga poda ziva bara mulabu chari kukaika
isi tingakwanisi kana tukumwe sanga watereka nkhari
kwechikwa chakusuza yaya mulabu chikwa chakusuza yaya mungachepe chambali
so vanyani vafika tatamchezwa mwe sanga kuti ninafukaza bwenini ndeni bungwene bwe icho chikuchipikira mwanakazi wali para nani
ya ivangaseka yaya mulamu kutola mukuona mulamu oro mu bible viri kulembeka kuti nikupangirenge movwiri uyu wakalenga adamu chiuti akalenga adamu nakuyoya kuti wakasanga kuti munthu lawana phukwa uchitachita wakukhalakhala kuti nikupangire pa movwiri munthu wakuti wakuovwirengepo mwanakazi dangu lake ni isi tiva uvwiri va inu nandi
so kuti muleke vana chakusuzwa lekanili mbani peni papa kweniwe wakuti mtimwane wafuma kuti ndikukapo kwenkhanana tikasupana ukapo ana nilikili njani suzgo iyi iwo kuinga kakumola mwakazi nango towa pa nyumba kweni mbwe ngasanga kuti ipo nikhale nilele vana vana kulekera vanyako vana vangakwanisika cha suzgo ipa pakale inenga niko mbakani iwo ndio hashika kao ndio kwa kambula kuti yana na ina ni mbakana
Now, I think it's important to stop the story there because it was tough. And for a long time, Winston was obdurate. And luckily, Jennifer and Anita became village leader. Well, Jennifer became a village leader and started teaching other women about agroecology. And finally, Winston got with the program. And I was there in August last year, and all of a sudden now he's built a house, built a house for his wife, and is participating in carrying water and cooking, and is also part of the village climate change committee. And it only took 4 years, which is amazing, to overturn these centuries of patriarchy in a durable way through hard organizing for $8 per person per year is incredible. But it's important to remember that there's nothing magic or easy about this. And if we stop the story then, as in a time that's similar to one we find ourselves in now, it will feel bleak and dire. And with lots of activist fervor and strength, over the course of just a few years, you can turn things around fairly dramatically. Let me show you what that means in this context around food. These are the under 5 stunting data for Malawi, and the allegation is that this is largely made up and it's still fairly high. But that's for Malawi in general. But if you look at the neonatal rehabilitation unit's admissions, from when the program started here, so these are the admissions of kids from this part of northern Malawi who are coming in acutely malnourished. You can see that here, it's over 250, and down here it's in single digits. It climbs back up because of an IMF-related currency shock and the poverty that came as a result of that. But you can see that here, here's a story of success. A story where, again, for pitifully little, you can change the terms of the food system. Change that household, the picture of which from 1750 we saw. Change the way that farming happens. Change the way that knowledge is distributed. Change the way that finance circulates, because the women have started their own financial collective. Change the way that care is distributed. Change the way that work works. Change one's relationship to nature. Change one's relationship to other lives. In other words, change the way that the entire food system operates. And we know that this is not an isolated story. We know that, in general, stunting increases with gender inequality from across the world. These are a range of countries from, the dot plot is the globe. And stunting decreases when girls go to secondary school. But all of that takes work. And it takes work to stitch together the transformations in agriculture, in who it is that we are, in the way that land is owned and distributed, the way that food is distributed, the way that it's grown, the way that we think about ourselves. All of that has to happen at the same time. And it can't come from someone telling you what to do, like I'm not doing right now. It has to come through the process of experimenting and knowledge. I mean, that's one of the joys of agroecology. It's one of the joys of John and Yvette's program here and of the students you've created, who are capable of emulating and modeling this kind of experimental behavior in the world, of becoming social scientists as well as natural scientists. But we can all do it. We've had that taken away from us by the food system. But there's no reason why, through things like envisioning land reform, envisioning reparations, we can't get that back. And that, I think, would be a good place to stop, just to remind us that, in fact, in these dark times, what we need to be doing is working through activism to imagine that better world and that better food system, because this one surely can't prevail for much longer. Thanks very much indeed.
Great. So we have until 8 o'clock. Can we dim the screen?
We can turn this
maybe?
off anyway. Let's go away. Out of that.
We'll be happy to take some questions from all of you. We can also just have broader discussion, linking together the talks that we've heard so far. Lily here in the front, and if you want to wave. Lily is monitoring the tweet station, so if you want to tweet in questions, that's also fine. We'll occasionally call on her. If you're in Detroit, feel free to participate in that way. You can tweet your questions. It's hashtag food literacy for all, right? Okay, great. So I don't know, do you want to start with a comment?
Yeah, I do have a question. So Raj said to me once, local food tastes great, won't end white supremacy. I'm wondering if you can talk about the potential that you see of the food movement to make the kind of systemic structural change that we need?
It depends what you think the food movement is. And I mean, I think I stand by that, that local food does taste good and it won't end white supremacy. Not you know, the consumption of local food can actually embed white supremacy, as we've seen. You know, the idea of gentrification with its racial contours and the attendant kind of desire for the local can be very racially inflected. But it also, I mean, I think this is a moment for the food movement to take stock and to wonder what the hell happened. Surely we were on a magic carpet ride with an organic garden in the White House that I'm sure has been plowed over by now. And you know, it was all going to be great. And then what happened? Well, obviously what happened is that the food movement floated away from and floated above deep and important concerns around race and around class, and to some extent around gender as well. And insofar as the food movement ends up being this kind of you know, a process of high-end food snobbery, I want nothing to do with it. But you know, as I imagine, you don't either. But there is an interesting model around shooting through ideas of race and class in the food movement that comes from slow food. You know, I mean, you know slow food, right? You know, does everyone know slow food?
We have a local chapter of slow food here.
Hello, slow food. So you'll have heard before the criticism that slow food can sometimes be a sort of circle jerk of olive oil fanciers and red wine fetishes. But harsh but fair, but not necessarily fair, because I mean, in its origins, slow food was a radical organization set up by people to the left of the Italian Communist Party, who were very concerned about workers' rights, and in particular workers of color in Italy, who were migrant workers and workers working, agricultural workers, who were underpaid and who weren't able to participate as equals in the process of enjoying the kinds of food that we celebrate as slow food. They weren't able to afford the very food that their hands had some part in producing. And so slow food organizers organized not only for higher wages for these workers, but also for you know, a 2-hour lunch break, so that people could actually enjoy the fruits of their labor as well as doing the other things we do at lunch break, but actually to take the time to savor and to enjoy. And what I like about that is, first of all, that there is a workerist component. There is, you know, by dint of there being migrant workers, a component of race. But there's also a component of pleasure. I mean, the food movement in general has been quite good about pleasure, and well done us for enjoying pleasure. But pleasure, I mean, pleasure can be a great tool for recruiting. And you know, particularly in these times where there are, you know, where we ought to be inviting new people to our tables and hearing new things and expanding our bounds of compassion, we also need to be understanding that white supremacy is a thing, and that that there are ways in which the food movement in general needs to recognize that, own that, explain that, and take steps towards ending it. And I think compassion and activism around farm workers and food, for example, is tremendously important. And understanding also the contours of hunger in the United States, which the food movement has been pretty bad about getting, and understanding the racially inflected and gendered components of that hunger in the United States. I mean, the fact that a third of female-headed households are likely to be food insecure in the United States, and I imagine that's going to go up. It's a scar on the conscience of the nation. And so I think that particularly for the food movement, these are things that we can do, but the food movement has been very bad at doing because we haven't been talking about class, not for want of trying, but particularly now. Here's a moment where if you felt like, oh, you were taken by surprise by all of this, then here's a moment to take stock and to think about the new alliances that need to be built in order that local food can be part of a move to end white supremacy. But yeah, otherwise it'll just we'll just have fine sandwiches at Whole Foods and let white supremacy carry on as usual.
Maybe see if we have a hand in the audience.
I terrified all of you? Sir?
Hold on 1 second and wait for the microphone. It's coming.
The question is, do you see any role for what I'll call agricultural science, which includes the Green Revolution or genetically modified seeds, etc., to feeding the future world population, or is it more of an infrastructure question around food?
No, I mean, thank you for that question. I mean, I love science. I mean, that's some of my best friends are scientists. But I mean, if you look at what the experiments that were happening in Malawi, for example, what is that if not science and peer review and critique of the very essence of what it is that constitutes good science is people doing experiments, sharing their data, figuring out what works and what doesn't, and then trying to retry the experiment and controlling for as much as they can. That was responsible in no small part for the massive efflorescence of the wide range of dietary diversity. So I mean, I'm a big fan of that science. I mean, if that's not science, I don't know what is. But am I a fan of the kind of the kind of treadmill that industrial agriculture has got us onto? Not really. And for the reasons that I've demonstrated. I mean, you can see that it's part and parcel of a range of social structures that are patriarchal, that are racist, and that siphon money away from the poor to the rich. Science is at some level an accomplice to that insofar as it perpetuates certain kinds of agricultural technology. But there are other kinds of agricultural technology that we need to be embracing and exploring, and I think they're vastly underfunded. So insofar as this is a plea to whoever it is that can make the kinds of science that John and Yvette are doing better funded, I think that people should give them money.
I think I'm going to build on that question to ask you a slightly, so I completely agree. If we look back at that painting you showed in 1750, I talk about similar trends in my class, and while I agree that most of industrial agriculture was in place by that time, you'll notice in that picture that crops and livestock are still integrated, for example. Since that time, we've just sort of extended and deepened, right? The extent to which agriculture has scaled up and become more mechanized. And I'm struck by the difference between the images we see in Malawi, where there's still a large rural population, plenty of labor for harvesting or doing these other tasks. And so how do you have a sort of theory of change within the most industrialized contexts where we don't necessarily have the labor in those regions to do agroecological production?
I certainly think that a good place to look is the ISTAT report, the IAA STD. It's an acronym done in committee, clearly. But the International Agricultural Assessment on Knowledge, Science and Technology for Development came up with a series of recommendations that are about urban and peri-urban agriculture and increasing the amount of food that is grown locally and regionally. But in order for that to obtain, you need land, and you need land reform. This is the land reform we're seeing at the moment is just the selling off of federal land. So it's not like land reform is unthinkable. It's happening right now. The government is at the moment putting through the pipeline the sale of an area the size of Connecticut to the highest bidder. So it's possible for the ownership of an area the size of Connecticut to be transferred like that by the federal government. And we're seeing that. It's only taken 10 days. So if we concede that certain kinds of large-scale transfer of land are possible, then let's talk about the terms and the politics in which those transfers happen. And for me, the terms and transfers of those politics, particularly in settler countries like this one, has to be around the idea of reparations. And this is an idea that's not just about reparations for slavery, but also reparations for genocide. For recognizing the bases on which this country was formed. So I think it's possible to develop a politics of redistribution that is inclusive, that helps to undermine white supremacy, that helps to recognize and help, for example, white people find a way out of, well, what do I do with this? Well, what you do with it is work towards making reparations happen and making redistribution happen that in some way addresses the privilege that we've all, just by dint of being in this country and surviving, to some extent have profited from, but also to recognize the racial bases of capitalism in this country and making them equitable. So that's the way of getting to the answer. Well, so what do we do with the land? Well, we have to redistribute it. What are the politics of that redistribution? If not sale to the highest bidder, has to be about reparation.
Can we bring a mic down front? We have a question on Twitter.
So this is a question from Twitter from a Detroiter asking for examples of successful urban agroecological movements. And I think that this is particularly a question that's focused on impoverished communities in this country.
I mean, the place that everyone looks is still Cuba. And even though Cuba is, what up, dough? Did I do that right?
You got it right.
Thank you. People laugh, and yeah, I try to do hook them horns as well when I'm in Texas, and it never comes up. But I mean, if you look at why Cuba works, it works through struggle. It's not like the government magically decided, oh well, we're gonna embrace these wonderful hippies who want to grow kale. It was born first of necessity as a result of the U.S. sanctions and the precipitous drop in particularly meat consumption, but a range of food consumption there. But it's also about the political organizing at the block level, where a lot of Cuban politics happens in the cities. There are local block party members, and organizing at the block and at the sort of suburb and the municipal level can work. But it means having political articulations between all of these spaces, and it means working politically. So I like Cuba for that reason, and some of these places still prevail despite a lingering war in Cuba between the industrial agriculturalists and the agroecologists. There are still very good examples still in Havana, for example, where urban agriculture works. But again, how do you get the land? You have to fight for it. It's never given freely.
We have a hand over here.
Hi, thank you for a great presentation. My question kind of derives from Stuffed and Starved. You talked a lot about co-ops being a path for the future, and you touched on Mondragon pretty extensively, and they have a really good network there. So I think the question is, if co-ops were to become more founded in this country, and I know, Malik, that there's a lot of work to be done in Detroit on this topic, how would it be that a good network could be set up that co-ops aren't cannibalizing each other, or like the ventures of capitalism aren't just stomping them out?
The second part of that question is easy. That there are actually quite a lot of very good cooperative alliances. Under the big sort of mothership of co-ops is the International Cooperative Alliance. ICA.coop is the website. And they do a very good job of sort of stitching together the different co-ops that exist around the world, and that there are US versions of that. I don't see co-ops necessarily being quite so dominant now that that there's not enough to go around. There's also a very good book by Jessica Gordon-Nemhart on the history of black cooperatives and how co-ops in the United States have often been ways in which people of color have fought back and resisted the sort of worst predations of the system of racial capitalism that we live under.
Collective Courage is the name of
the name of the book. That's it, right. I was blanking on the title. But yeah, Jessica Gordon-Nemhart is a brilliant, brilliant book. And yet, it's important to remember, that co-ops aren't magic. That they exist within society. And there are 7 pillars in the cooperative that every cooperative has, and the last of them is being connected to the community, about a relationship and a duty of care toward the community, a responsibility towards the community. And that can be very hard to execute for co-ops. I mean, I don't know of a co-op that's done it very well, because, for example, Mondragon, one of the largest industrial co-ops in the world, is in the business of industrial manufacturing, and they have a very big carbon footprint, and it's very hard for them to square the fact that they are huge polluters, and it's still the workers who are running the show, and isn't that great? Because if we're interested in reining in the idea of cheap nature, then there are a lot of costs that need to be internalized in cooperatives that have yet to be internalized. And so this idea of internalizing costs, I'm actually sort of averse to it, but the idea that the playing field itself needs to be transformed so that cooperatives can thrive. I think that's a very good idea, but that requires much more political work than cooperatives have been necessarily committed to. So, yes, there are networks of cooperatives. I wish they were more political and understood their heritage. I mean, the first cooperative was set up as a result of a wandering socialist lecturer moving through a North England mill town. And leaving behind him a bunch of people who were like, we got to do this. And instead of overthrowing the government and setting up socialism, they set up a cooperative. But it was still a way for them to maintain control, to be able to make sure that the food they ate was safe, and at least that they would be able to eat. And I think that this idea of sort of extending empathy, of extending the boundaries of the people, of who it is that can be part of the co-op, is a political project. And it's one that co-ops can address at their will, and I wish that they willed to do it more.
Thank you, Raj. You're an intellectual role model.
I'm just British.
Given that science has been sort of a handmaiden to violent power structures, patriarchy and so forth, how do you see those scientists who are aware of that, how do you think they could be good communicators of that, given that a majority of the scientific community sees itself as neutral and objective?
I'm not sure. I mean, at some level, I mean, there are the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Ricardo was here, right? I mean, he seems to me to have his finger on the pulse of what it is to be accountable. But the idea of being an accountable academic, I think in general, is an important idea, right? I mean, insofar as we are privileged enough to work within the boundaries of an institution where the state gives us money to teach and to think, that's awesome. I mean, but with that privilege, surely comes the need to be accountable not just to our students and to and to the people we serve, but to society at large. And so this isn't just a question for natural scientists. I think social scientists also find themselves falling into this. They should be addressing this far more than they are. Economists, in particular, wherever you are. I mean, but I think that's what activist academics should be doing, is modeling and being vulnerable and creating networks through which they may be held to account by the people who live with the consequences of their actions. So insofar as, every project I've done, I've made mistakes, right? Everyone fucks up. But who is it that tells you that you fucked up? Who is it that can hold you to account and say, no, this was wrong, you have to do this, you have to fix this? What I love about Rachel Besner-Kerr's work is that she continually goes back to the same communities and can be held to account. And insofar as I do activist and academic work, I find myself with the same activists and I present my work and I have them peer review. And I think that that's a way that we can hold our feet to the fire beyond the community of fellow scholars. Obviously, you peer review among your among your credentialed peers. But if we're again extending the idea of who is the people, who gets to be an intellectual, then surely everyone has the right to do that, because everyone can. And in the world of C.L.R. James, every cook can govern. And I like the idea that everyone can and should peer review. And so if that involves a bit more translation and a bit more going back and have I got this right, then it extends the process of field work and it extends your budgets a little bit. But it's much better to do that than to be the kind of social scientist who goes in, takes, and leaves. So I mean, I think that that's, in general, what it is that we ought to be doing as engaged academics, whether in the natural sciences or elsewhere.
And not to be a downer, but possibly going to become more difficult with the decrease in public funding for academics.
Harshing my mellow. No.
Let's be real. Yeah. We have time for one more question. Does anyone have one? Yeah, Teresa.
So the perception that individuals have that we are responsible for the food that we eat, is that a correct perception? And then is it a useful or detrimental perception for the agroecological revolution?
Oh, that's a great question. So is it that, so we perceive, yes, I'm responsible for putting this food into my mouth. So this isn't to sort of mess with the idea of, that that we are agentless. It's not to say, well, Monsanto put it there and I didn't really have many options and so I did it. It's not a sort of Monsanto made me do it argument. But it's an argument that suggests that actually the ways in which we think we make choices and the ways that we are free are not. So we are less free than we think we are in some ways. So when you go to the supermarket, everything about that space is curated and surveilled to make us consume more, and to imagine that we are free agents in this in this petri dish of consumer exploitation is a helpful delusion to the retailers, but not necessarily to us. On the other hand, we are freer than we think in imagining what the alternatives are. The line that's going around at the moment is that people can far more readily imagine the end of the world than they can imagine the end of capitalism. And actually, we need to be imagining, who is it that's stopping us imagining a world after capitalism, something better than capitalism? Well, we can own that, but we can then go forward with it. And that kind of freedom, I think, is very helpful, recognizing that and embracing the possibility of, well, look, your homework is to dream that world after capitalism and make it better. If there's stuff you like about capitalism, like free exchange in markets where no one is coerced, let's run with that. Let's take that. And then let's build on that. But whatever it is, you're free to imagine that. No one is stopping you. And yet we find ourselves like, we're all going to die. Can't imagine that. We're fucked. So insofar as we allow ourselves to imagine and to dream that bigger world, and in which agroecology must play a part, but not just agroecology in the fields, but a certain kind of social scientific agroecology of understanding who it is that's doing the work and how that work is distributed and how it is that we imagine finance happening and how it is that we relate to nature. All of that we get to dream. So far it's been dreamed for us, like the furrows of, we find ourselves just following the furrows of the plow, but we don't have to. And that is a way that we have yet to experiment being free, and now's a good time to try.
Great note to end on. Let's thank Dr. Patel again.
Thank you. Excellent.